Again, remember, think through what Jesus said was the whole Old Testament was about him. I'm suggesting to you that Genesis 1 through 11 tells the story of Jesus. But not in an obvious way, right? We have to think about it. I'm going to suggest to you that there are two primary ways in which Genesis 1 through 11, and indeed the whole Old Testament, tells the story of Jesus. Two ways. Prophecy and typology. The first way, Genesis 1 through 11, tells the story of Jesus is through a literary device called typology. Notice I said literary device. Literary device. So this is like, right, if you think, if you are in an English class, or if you had, I don't know what kind of high schools you came from, but if you did any kind of literature in high school, you probably are familiar with terms like alliteration, or rhyme, meter, right? All of these are literary devices, right? Things that a writer puts into their text to make it memorable, or to help communicate whatever it is that author wants to communicate. Typology is a literary device. The English word type comes from the Greek word typos, which means a shape, an outline, a model, or a pattern. It is like when a person draws a picture with a pencil for another person to paint with colors. The first person draws only the shape, the type, the typos. Then the second person fills the shape with colors, making the complete image, which is the antitype. Antitype. Or in Greek, typos, antitypos. This anti, right, in English, this prefix tends to mean against. It doesn't mean against. It just means the typos that's opposite. Get it? Typos that is opposite. So this is the typos. This is the typos that is opposite. So the corresponding one. Think about it like it's the one that corresponds to it. Type comes first. But it's not clear, right? It's like only a shape, only an outline. And then later you get the full image. Noah is a type of Christ. But Noah was just an outline. Jesus is the full image. The Apostle Paul uses this same word type when explaining to the church in Corinth how to interpret and apply the Old Testament. But the Apostle Paul says, reason why you should read the Old Testament is because it's like warnings for us, right? He's like, look what happened to them, don't do the same thing. When in that passage, he uses this word typos. He says, those things were written as types. Now these things occurred as examples or types to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Things like being like God, for example. These things happened to them as examples or types and were written down as warnings for us on whom the culmination of the ages has come. 1 Corinthians 10, 6 through 11. As we go along reading the Old Testament, right? St. Paul says we're going to see these things called types. Right? That's what he says in Romans 5 about Adam. When we read the story of Adam, this is like a hint of something that's going to come. And what he says is when you get to Jesus and you read the story of Jesus, you should be thinking, oh, this is just like Adam, but it's different. In Genesis 1 through 11, the story of Noah is a type of the story of Jesus. Noah is not exactly like Jesus, but Noah shows us a picture of Jesus. The Genesis author contrasts Adam and Noah. The Genesis author. In a similar way, the Apostle Paul contrasts Adam and Jesus in the New Testament. Noah is not a savior as Jesus is. Noah could not save anyone from their sin. But we can read the story of Noah and see a picture of what Jesus is like. A man who does right what Adam did wrong. A man who obeys God. The only ones who were saved from God's judgment in the flood were people who were part of Noah's family. That is, in the ark. Right? You had to be in the ark to be saved. In a similar way, only those who have become part of the family of Jesus can be saved from God's judgment for their sins. Just as Noah received God's first covenant with humankind, so Jesus provides God's final covenant for all humanity. Flood is the type, and baptism is the antitype. That's what Peter is saying. Is that kind of like...
It's like good.
So, starting from verse 18, 1 Peter 3. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unjust, which is to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. After being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. In it, only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water, and this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. Not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience toward God. If you were to read the NKJV, the New King James Version, the word antitype appears there, because the Greek word antitype. This water is the antitype. In other words, salvation, right? Baptism is the antitype of the flood. Do you see the connection that the Apostle Peter makes between the story of Noah and the story of Jesus? The smaller flood story has the same shape as the larger salvation story. When we are baptized as Christians, we are retelling the story of the flood. When we are baptized, that's what we are doing. Right? We are proclaiming to Jesus, Jesus, I know, I believe, you are Lord, you're going to come back and judge this earth. I'm trusting in you that when you do that, you are going to save me from that judgment in the same way that you saved Noah from the flood. And that's the point, right? Like water comes onto you, like depending on what kind of church tradition you come from, either you are dunked under the water and then come back up, or the water comes onto you, right? Like onto your head. But you don't die. That's the point. You don't die. You continue to live. When we are baptized as Christians, we are retelling the story of the flood. Through baptism, we proclaim our faith that Jesus will save us through the final judgment, just as God saved Noah and his family through the first judgment, the flood. So this is the first way that Genesis 1 through 11 tells us the story of Jesus, through typology. The story of Noah is a type of the story of Christ. Noah shows us a picture of Jesus. The second way that Genesis 1 through 11 tells us the story of Jesus is through prophecy. And this involves the genealogies. The genealogies of Genesis point us toward Jesus. In fact, the genealogies begin the whole story of the Bible's prophecy about the coming Messiah who will save people from sin and death. God makes a promise that one of Eve's children, or grandchildren, or great-grandchildren, but someone who will come from her family line, will finally defeat the serpent. Of course, we now know that the serpent in Genesis 3 is not just a talking snake, but is Satan himself. See Revelation 12:9. We call this prophecy the proto-evangelium, which is a Latin word that means first gospel. This is the very first proclamation of the gospel that God will provide a person who can save humanity from sin and death. Now stop and think a moment. Seriously. When you read that prophecy in Genesis 3:15, what's the first question that comes to your mind? Who is it? Right? Who is it? Which child of Eve will it be? The whole Bible is built on this one question, and the whole book of Genesis is built on this one question. Who is the one that was promised? As we move forward in the story with each new birth, we should be wondering, maybe this is the one. At the start of chapter 4, Cain is born. Right? If you're reading the story carefully, once you get to Genesis 4:1, you should be like, oh, this is it. Before we can find out, Eve gives birth to another son, Abel. But Cain kills Abel, and neither one of them is the Messiah. But at the end of chapter 4, Eve gives birth to another son named Seth. Now, if you're reading the story carefully, you should be like, oh, surely this is the one. But when we read chapter 5, we see that Seth dies too. He was not the Messiah either. And one after another, more sons and daughters are born, and they all die, and still the Messiah has not come. Okay, are you feeling the tension? Right? As the Old Testament goes, you should be feeling this tension. It should be getting stronger and stronger. Do you see that Lamech? Do you see what Lamech says when Noah is born? He will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands caused by the ground. The Lord is cursed. which is way back in Genesis 3. Lamech gave birth to a son, and he thought Noah was the one. Do you get that? He's like, oh, this must be the one. Then starting in chapter 6, we read the story of the flood and of Noah's righteousness and obedience, and it looks like Lamech might be right. Maybe Noah really is the promised one. But after the flood, we see that Noah sins and dies too, just like everybody else. Noah was not the Messiah after all. When you get to Shem, you should be thinking the exact same thing. And when you get to Abraham, you should be thinking the exact same thing. And when you get to Jacob, you should be thinking the exact same thing. And when you get to Moses, you should be thinking the exact same thing. And when you get to David, you should be thinking the exact same thing. And when you get to Solomon, you should be thinking the exact same thing. And when you get to Isaiah, maybe you should be thinking the exact same thing. Do you get the point? But what happens is rather than the story getting better and better, right, as that tension grows and grows and grows, the story just gets more tragic and more